Okay. Welcome to What's the Big Idea? Thinking critically about suicide and suicide prevention. I'm Desiree Stage. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a white settler on unceded Lenni Lenape territory, or so-called Philadelphia. I want to let you know that I have two toddlers upstairs, and you may hear toddler sounds, screaming, elephants, songs, elephant sounds, stomping. Um, And before I go any further, I want to show you a video about the work I do to give you a little bit of background on me, and then I'll also talk about it. Live Through This is a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors across the United States. So the catalyst for starting the project was personal experiences I had with depression, with self-injury, with my own suicide attempt, and I also lost friends to suicide. And I noticed that we don't talk openly about our personal experiences with suicide and with suicidal thoughts and suicidal feelings. And I just wanted to change that.
Live Through This is important because it's important for people to see that there's hope after an attempt and that there's people out there like them and they're not alone. Not feeling alone is a big deal as a human being.
If people don't understand it, this might give them a chance to see, like, there's a human here. It is something I think that a lot of people maybe deal with at some point in time, and it's nice to just have some solidarity there for them and with them,
A lot of suicide attempt survivors have never told the story from front to back because they've never been encouraged to. So I give them that space. And afterwards, I make a portrait.
To see people's souls within their eyes, it was amazing. To be able to create that bond that you're not alone, it could help so many others.
I've seen suicide from so many different angles, and so I understand it from an academic perspective. But more importantly, I understand it from lived experience, from a very personal perspective. So when I sit down with somebody and they tell me their story, they know that they're sitting with somebody who's been there too.
When I found the project, I thought, wow, fantastic. This is a way for me to talk without somebody giving me a really strange look or trying to give me medication or trying to lock me up or telling me how wrong I was about something.
And to be able to have a conversation with someone else who's experienced that, you're not going to be judged, and to be able to open up and be honest about that experience. I felt like I was being heard with every single word.
I want people to come away understanding suicide better or wanting to understand it better. I want them to be more open to talking about it, because one thing we know is that asking about suicide saves lives.
And we just need to reach out and say, we can talk about it, we can approach it, it does happen, and the more we're scared of it, the more difficult it can be for people who face it because they know they have nowhere to go. And that feeling of having nowhere to go and no one to speak with kind of makes it worse in the first place.
It connects us to our stories, not only for the stories that we're reading of other attempt survivors, but the stories that are untold within ourselves. And it gives us hope and an opportunity to know that recovery is possible.
The story's ready to be told to everybody. Get it out there. Let people see that I'm a regular human being.
When I listen to the stories of suicide attempt survivors like me, I don't hear weakness. I don't hear selfishness. I hear courage. I hear compassion. I hear resilience. I hear survival. I hear life. This project is not about death. This project is about life. That's why I called it Live Through This.
The people who are on that brink, they say, listen, there's a whole nother side to this. There is so much love in the world still, so, soldier on, man, you know what I mean?
Redeemed.
All right. So I am an artist, a self-trained photographer, a writer, and I use all of those skills and my psychology degree and all of the training and reading and studying and mentorship that I've received over the past decade to work in suicidology and suicide prevention. I've been doing this work since 2010. I am a suicide attempt survivor, a suicide loss survivor. I've seen the aftermath of a public suicide that was really traumatizing for me. And I'm someone with lived experience of self-injury. Beyond working on Live Through This, I'm an active member of the American Association of Suicidology. I've helped write media reporting guidelines for journalists. I've consulted on Broadway shows like, where's that one? um, I've consulted on things like apps for suicidal people that'll be used in emergency rooms, artificial intelligence apps to help train clinicians on how to better work with suicidal people. Oh, that's me. That was supposed to be happening this whole time. Look at me being pensive. I produce and co-host a video podcast called Suicide and Stuff, which is, as you can see by the art, meant to be irreverent and really informal and show that, you know, we can have these conversations, we can be playful and humorous and still be talking about suicide, still be working to change things. We talk about all kinds of subjects. We talked about suicide in film. We've talked about suicide and spirituality. We bring in lots of researchers, well-known suicidology researchers, and we do that every other Tuesday. This is not supposed to be a commercial for that. I just don't know how to not talk about it. I've done a lot of media over the years. I was on CNN with Anderson Cooper a couple years ago after Anthony Bourdain died. It's in People magazine, big 6-page spread of all the stories, not all of them, but a lot of the stories of people that I've interviewed. I've interviewed almost 200 people, and you can see a little temple cameo. I got the copy, my first copy of that magazine on campus. And when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, I'm usually traveling to give talks about my work nationwide. I am also a social work student, so this talk is geared specifically toward social workers. So let's do some basics. Language. We are kind of moving away from suicide survivor because it's a little confusing. We're moving toward, you know, being clearer with our language. So someone who is a suicide attempt survivor is someone who lived through a suicide attempt. A suicide loss survivor is a person who lost someone to suicide. Someone with lived experience has direct personal experience with suicidality or suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts and actions. Those are phrases you might hear describing the experience. We don't say someone committed suicide anymore. I know that's kind of what we're used to, but it's kind of a really loaded terminology. It implies pathology, sin, criminality. We also don't say completed suicide. That for a couple of years was accepted, and now we're moving away from it because the language here is constantly evolving. I'm sure you'll notice it's pretty clunky. We don't say someone had a successful suicide. That feels obvious to me. Instead, we'll say someone died by or from or of suicide. People have semantic feelings about that too, but died by suicide is safe. We talk about suicide deaths, or we say someone took their own life. We also don't say, you know, that people had failed suicide attempts. Instead, we would say that they had a non-fatal suicide attempt, or more simply, just a suicide attempt. We try to avoid insensitive language, like I'm going to kill myself in a superficial context. You know, if I don't get the grade I want, I'm going to kill myself. I'm super guilty of this, but we try not to say that. Gesturing toward your body using your hand like a gun, kind of similarly, or, you know, we don't say someone is acting so manic if, you know, they don't have that diagnosis. And even then, you know, like it's just, unless you know that's accepted from the person and that's a way that they use language too, I wouldn't do that. We don't talk about, the weather being so schizophrenic today. There's no need to give diagnoses to things that are not people, and even people, it's kind of debatable. We don't say crazy, insane to describe things. Suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. It's selfish, it's weak. This is all stuff to avoid. Now that that's out of the way, the perspective I'm going to give you today is not what you would hear in mainstream suicide prevention. It's informed by lived experience, which has historically been, ignored and invalidated in the field. It's informed by a skepticism of a mental health system with a long history of abuses against people like me. I center my lived experience in everything I do. I'm always thinking of the person experiencing suicidal thoughts or crisis from a first person perspective because I've been there, but I think also it's a perspective that we haven't really thought about in the suicidology field or in the clinical mental health care field. So the things that I have to say about treatment or hospitalization often fly in the face of the established narrative because people with lived experience have never been consulted about how these things affect them. And this has to do with society's general attitudes toward the mentally ill and suicidal people being lesser than, or lacking insight, or that we don't have the capacity to make our own decisions to know what's best for us. So all of that, no. What I want to do today is broaden the scope of suicide for you. That is my end goal, and do a bit of educating. I'm going to ask you to think critically about anything and everything you think you know about suicide and anything you hear about suicide in the future. Ask lots of questions. I want to give you big ideas, not the usual ideas. Maybe one day you'll be offered a suicide prevention training like ASSIST, Safe Talk, Mental Health First Aid, QPR. Those are kind of the basic trainings. I am a QPR trainer. I'm trained in a couple of different crisis intervention techniques. I could do that today, but I'm not going to. You're not going to learn everything you need to know today. And you won't learn everything you need to know in a 90-minute training or a day-long training or a training that lasts several days. Suicide is too complex. The field is too young. Our knowledge base isn't developed enough, and it evolves constantly. This is knowledge you gain over time through conversations with people with lived experience, lost survivors, suicidologists, through research and self-reflection. Interrogate your own thoughts on mental health, mental illness, and suicidality. Interrogate your thoughts on how people deserve to be treated. Think especially about how the suicidal people deserve to be treated when they're in crisis, or mentally ill people when they're in the street yelling at what looks like nothing to you. Think about what your discomfort means and whether that means you have the right to act on them without their consent. How would you want to be treated if you were that person? A lot of this work comes down to that. How would you want to be treated? Always try to put yourself in someone else's shoes. This goes for everyone here listening, not just people training to be clinicians. More than half of the US population at least knows someone affected by suicide if they haven't been affected personally in some way. So this information really is relevant to everyone. And your answers to these questions as you're thinking about it are not going to be clear or easy to come by probably, but it helps to have a sense of how you feel in the case that you're in a position to support someone. And your feelings on this will likely also evolve. The code of ethics is relevant here, the social workers' code of ethics. Our mission as social workers is to enhance human well-being and to help meet the basic needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable and oppressed. We focus on individual well-being in a social context and the well-being of suicidology. So we're looking at things at individual and systems levels and those interactions between the two. We pay particular attention to the environmental forces that create, contribute, and address problems in living, contribute to and address problems in living. We value diversity, equity, inclusion, and we work against discrimination, prejudice, and oppression. Some of our core values are particularly relevant here. Social justice. It is our job to challenge social injustice, especially with regard to the vulnerable and oppressed, people who have been abused in the ways that people who are mentally ill or suicidal have been abused in the past. This is a civil rights issue. This is a social justice issue. Yeah, the mental health system has a long, harmful history, whether we like it or not. People have been experimented on, sterilized here in the US because they had psychiatric diagnoses. Many are houseless or get arrested, so social services and the carceral system play a role. People in crisis can be involuntarily committed and restrained chemically or physically. The suicide risk is increased in the first week after a hospitalization, so it stands to reason that this kind of treatment makes them even more vulnerable. Just as social work often ignores its white supremacist origins, suicidology and mental health generally ignore these abuses. This ties into our responsibility to respect and value the inherent dignity and worth of a person, to treat everyone with respect and be mindful of differences, to respect a person's self-determination. That's huge. The Code of Ethics prizes self-determination. Suicide prevention does not. As long as you're alive, that's just what we need. That's worth always being cognizant of. If you think people with mental health issues don't deserve agency, you will do harm. How do you help a suicidal person and help them retain their agency? How do you help them maintain safety as they define it? We don't talk about ethics enough in suicidology, so I appreciate that it comes up often in social work. And competence. We should always be learning, and we should only practice within areas of competence. So let's talk about education and training. I wrote this issue brief for my policy class. Obviously, you can't read it in this slide. I just want to show you what it looks like. But if you want to read it, you can download it at the URL to the left. I'm also going to put it on the resource page that I've made for this presentation. We're going to focus in on that second page. So training is limited. Most mental health and behavioral health professionals have very, very little training, which is terrifying and egregious given that suicide prevention's main method is reach out and get help. Social workers specifically make up 80% of the mental health workforce, and they get less than 4 hours of training in suicide-specific coursework. This does not account for the quality of training either. And if we don't have enough people trained, we also don't have enough people to teach and train our students. So this is a huge problem. Given that, 87% of clinical social workers have worked with suicidal clients. 55% have worked with a client who attempted suicide. If you are one of these 87 or 55% and you don't have training, what do you do? What do you do? 20 to 30% of clinical social workers will lose a client to suicide. And clinician loss is unique, traumatic, and lonely. And it's an experience very few people talk about. Most people who have training in this have it because they were affected by it and they sought it out. Which brings us back to the idea of competence. Most mental health clinicians, meaning most social workers, are not competent to do the work. And many do harm to clients because of it. So it is our ethical responsibility to make sure we have appropriate training, not so that we don't practice with these clients, because that's also a problem in the field. But it's on us to make sure that we get the training, because suicidal people do need help or support. So let's go through some basics. Myths. If you talk about suicide, you'll put the idea in a person's head. No. If you're worried about it, they've probably already considered it. In my work, I've found that people are really grateful to talk about it with someone who won't judge them or try to lock them up. And when in crisis, being able to open up about it can kind of act like a pressure valve. Corey D. Will says that conversations about suicide are not only okay to have, and they're helpful for all parties. So this is a tweet. The other day, I asked my Twitter followers, if you were giving a presentation essentially with the greatest hits of suicide prevention, what would you say? So we'll see a lot of these tweets throughout the presentation. And the people who follow me are A lot of them are social workers, psychologists, some psychiatrists, lots of people with lived experience, lots of people with lived experience who are professionals. So these are people who really know about this topic. Let's see. Talking openly. I'm not going to go through these too much, and you can kind of pause and read, or I'll make sure you have the slide deck so you can look at it later at your leisure. Suicidal thoughts are not a death sentence. We'll come back to that. Another myth. People who want to kill themselves will find a way to kill themselves. This is usually not the case. Most people can't maintain crisis level emotion for very long. It's so intense that, you know, usually it burns out fairly quickly within a few hours. And the biggest element of crisis intervention is distraction. If you can support someone through a crisis, they're less likely to end up killing themselves. One of the most famous examples is the Golden Gate Bridge. They have phones that go directly to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline on the bridge, as well as people who patrol the bridge to prevent suicide deaths, you know, so they'll talk to people. Most of the people who lived after that jump, most of the people who lived either because they were intervened on or because they survived, don't go back and try again. Most people, and most people who attempt suicide, 90% of us go on to live out our lives. Many suicides happen out of the blue. Not true. Most suicidal people will communicate intent or show signs. I think what it comes down to is that most people don't know what to look for. And that is not the fault of you know, the people who were around them. It's the fault of the system. Why aren't we teaching people? We talked about this. Only experts can prevent suicide. Also a myth. We already covered it. No, the training's not there for professionals to be the only ones preventing suicide. The other thing is that families, friends, and even strangers are very often the ones who are diffusing crises. People don't seek professional support for a lot of reasons. Fear is one, not wanting to be hospitalized, a history of trauma, lack of access. And professionals usually work regular business hours. My therapist is not there at 2 a.m. when I'm thinking about suicide. But you know who is? My wife. And she knows what to do when I'm having those thoughts. The next one, people who talk about suicide are just looking for attention. I love this reply by H.E. Casson. They said, replace the word attention with support. People who talk about suicide are just looking for support. It's a cry for support. And Jackie Thompson said, we're not looking for attention, we're looking to stop the pain. So, oh, no. Well, okay, so the next myth, also, not to mention famous people want our attention and we give it to them freely. You know, what's that about? I didn't mean to go to statistics yet. We're still on myths. One of the other myths is most suicide deaths occur around the holidays. I'm gonna go back to this. Most suicide deaths occur around the winter holidays. Also not true. That tends to be the time of year when people are most socially connected. Suicide rates are lowest in December, not by much, but you know, it still dispels the myth. Suicide rates are actually highest in April and July, you know, when the weather changes, when people are coming out of hibernation. Suicide only affects people with mental illness. I'm going to come back to this later. Also not true. Okay, now statistics. We love our statistics in suicidology. I apologize for the wall of text. It's not super important, honestly. This is the kind of information you'll find on the website of every major suicide prevention organization. What I want to point out here is the information that we don't see in this wall of text. What is on the other side of these statistics? I've got sex, but only 2 of the 3 sexes. There's no data on intersex people. Gender missing altogether, sexual orientation, any race or ethnicity that's not white. There's nothing about religion, socioeconomic status, nothing. And this is what's presented on all of these websites. It is worth pointing out the numbers don't tell the truth. We should be skeptical of statistics as a rule. But in terms of suicide, I think the numbers around suicide attempts and suicide deaths are a good deal larger than we think or we know. Some suicide deaths appear ambiguous or accidental. Some coroners are freaked out by it, or there's a sense of shame from the family, and people's minds can be changed, and so causes of death can be changed. I think that doesn't happen very often, but I know that it does. What else? Some suicide deaths appear ambiguous or accidental. So think about opioid overdoses. Sometimes we don't know if that was intentional. Car accidents. Sometimes we don't know if that was intentional. Many suicide attempts go unreported also. People don't want to call attention to it, don't want to be judged, or they feel like failures, or they don't want to be hospitalized. I know plenty of people who attempted suicide, woke up the next day and went to work, and no one ever knew. Gender is a spectrum. So when we have these stats on sex, like the one about women attempting suicide 3 times more than men, we are not capturing information on those who don't identify on either end of the binary. And what does that mean? A lot of this does come down to how coroners and police collect data, but that needs to change. Suicide also manifests differently for people with different backgrounds. And we know very little about how it affects marginalized communities, so we're likely not catching a lot of important data. Victor Armstrong, who's a suicide advocate, suicide prevention advocate, says we have to take these things into account. More facts and statistics, but these are the ones I like because I went and found these myself. Again, important to be critical of everything you hear. Suicidology is normed on cisgender, heterosexual white people. We know very little about how it affects other communities. We haven't made it a priority to fund research or disseminate the research that does exist. So some of what we do know is that racism is associated with suicidal thoughts. Shocking, right? We talk about bullying a lot and as a cause of suicide, and we really don't talk about bullying with any nuance. It can contribute to suicide, but with suicide, there's never one single cause. So victims and perpetrators of bullying are at a higher risk, not just victims. People who are both victims and perpetrators are at the highest risk for suicide. The elderly have the highest suicide rate of any age group. Latinx youth are more likely to attempt suicide than white or Black youth. Poverty is an issue. Suicide disproportionately affects Native Americans and Alaska Natives. Think about historical trauma, generational trauma, boarding schools, having your culture taken away from you, your spirituality, told you can't speak your own language, made your whole look being made to change. 40% of young LGBTQ people have considered suicide in the last year, and more than 50% of trans and non-binary youth considered suicide in the last year. Things we don't talk about unless we're having a specialized talk on suicide and the LGBTQ community, or suicide in this, not just suicide in people. Let's see, so warning signs. And I love warning signs. The ones on all the organizational websites usually don't, they're just, it's the same kind of blasé, vague stuff that doesn't really necessarily speak to people's experiences. A warning sign indicates an immediate suicide risk. Some obvious warning suicides are obvious: direct statements about suicide, clear despair, an inability to function. But sometimes a person may be more indirect and say things like, I can't do this anymore. Everyone would be better off without me. I probably won't be around much longer. I wish I could just go to sleep and not wake up. Um, Other things included in standard suicide prevention lists: increased use of alcohol or drugs, researching suicide methods, withdrawing or isolating from friends, family, and activities, extreme changes in sleep or appetite, saying goodbye. That happened to me. One of my best friends called me and said goodbye. Sorry about my baby crying. Giving their things away. Some less obvious ones are a recent crisis or traumatic event, relationship troubles, legal issues, financial issues, hate crimes, grief, sexual assault, police brutality. I think this is important to note. Suicidal people don't always present as textbook. And there is not a face of suicide or suicidality. And that's kind of what my work with Live Through This is about. It's all of our faces. You know, when you go to my website, you see just this wall of faces, and you can click on each face and read their story. So this is about everyone. And because sometimes people don't, show up in the textbook way, we might not catch it. So again, that's why we have to constantly be educating ourselves. When you're immersing yourself in this content, you get an intuition about it. Risk factors and protective factors. Risk factors indicate that someone is at heightened risk for suicide. It doesn't mean they're at an imminent risk in the same way warning signs do. And protective factors are reasons someone might be protected from suicide, things that make them safer. I don't want to go through this list. I added some things though that wouldn't be on your standard list. So prolonged stressors like experiencing racism and microaggressions, harassment, bullying, chronic pain. If you're talking to someone who is suicidal, you should always ask them, about their pain. Again, historical or generational trauma, concern about deportation or someone you love being deported, stressful life events like familial rejection. Trans people, when they come out, a lot of the time will be kicked out of their homes, will be rejected by their families. Other life transitions or losses. So the death of people who are deeply important to you, a big move that you didn't want to make where you then don't have friends or, a social circle. Exposure to suicide, traumatic experiences like childhood abuse, involvement in the foster and carceral systems, molestation, houselessness. Protective factors though, social connection, cultural, religious, or personal beliefs that discourage suicide. And actually that can also be a risk factor. I've talked to a few Black women specifically who say that religion can go either way, which I thought was super interesting. Access to healthcare, employment, housing, safety and stability in general. What else? Feeling responsible to or for others. Pets keep people alive, kids keep people alive, partners, roommates, friends. What else? Feeling equal to others, becoming a citizen, gaining rights you didn't have previously, like marriage equality. Suicide rates among queer people have changed since marriage equality was passed. And with trans kids, if you use their name and their pronouns, that is a protective factor. So let's see. Context is important though. You want to take all the warning signs and risk factors and protective factors and then put them into context. Suicide prevention tends to locate suicide within a person and makes it about a mental illness. But social work trains us to open our eyes and look around. How is the system failing the person? Are they having an abnormal reaction to a normal environment, or are they having a normal reaction to an abnormal environment? We don't ask that question a lot. As social workers, this idea should come pretty naturally to you. Quick thoughts on suicide bereavement, because a lot of people don't know too much about it. When people die naturally, we have an easier time accepting it. But when we lose someone to suicide, it's one of the most complex and longest lasting forms of grief. a lot of the time you don't get over it. It's you don't move on. It becomes a part of your life. And a lot of people who have experienced grief related to suicide come into the field and do advocacy work. One question all survivors have is why? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? And again, they will ask that question their whole lives. Only 15 to 18% of people who die by suicide leave notes, and usually they're instructions. Feed my cat. Here's where my stuff is. They're not emotional, they're not explanations. So we kind of have to get used to not knowing. And that honestly, that goes for all of this work. There's a lot of not knowing going on. People who are bereaved by suicide have a lot of self-blame, a lot of it. What could I have done better? When I talked to them the last time, did I say the wrong thing? Did I do something to make this happen? One of the therapeutic techniques for suicide grief is when people are doing all of that self-blaming, you can say, all right, okay, let's put you on trial. I'll let you put yourself on trial, but you have to promise that it's going to be a fair trial. And we can kind of interrogate those ideas. So let's see, self-injury and suicide. A history of self-injury is also a risk factor for suicide. They are connected, self-injury and suicidal behavior, but they're not synonymous. Self-injury is also known as NSSI, non-suicidal self-injury, and it tends to be about emotional control. In some cases, it can also serve as harm reduction for suicide. Me, I cut myself for 9 years. In my case, it was about taking pain I couldn't see because it was up here and making it visible. If I could see the hurt, that meant that I wasn't crazy or that I wasn't, at least making it up. It was there, it was tangible. Okay, a tweet. Another. Let's see. This is key. This is key information for me. We have always associated suicide with mental illness, but the CDC came out with this report in 2018 that said 54% of Americans who died by suicide over a 17-year period did not have a known mental health history. And, you can tear the data apart. I certainly did. You can ask lots of questions about data collection and, who was collecting it and how it was analyzed and blah, blah, blah. But taking this as it is, at the very least, it tells us that suicide and mental illness are not married. They're not always joined. And we do say in suicide prevention that many factors contribute to suicide. And so what we were learning was across people with mental illness, mental health diagnoses, and people who didn't have a history, we have all of these factors. Relationship problems, huge, 42%. Substance abuse, recent crises, physical health problems, job and financial problems, loss of housing, legal problems. These are our life problems. These are things so many of us go through. What does it mean? Suicide's about suffering. It's about hopelessness. It's about feeling out of control. All of the things listed there are regular parts of life. Because suicide, much like any other tragedy, is a part of life, whether we like it or not. So how do we help people want to stay? How do we help them build a life worth living? Ruth Potter is a psychology student. She's a PhD student. She says anyone can have thoughts of suicide. It can be an expected response to any number of things. She's also a practicing clinician. The accepted approach to suicide prevention is therapy and meds. It's mental health. Despite what we're seeing here, what if we listened to what people were telling us and we provided them with resources that were more closely linked to what they were struggling with? Even if it's in addition to mental health treatment, what if we're working with them on that breakup, how to feel less lonely, how to change your whole life, how to open a new bank account? What if, if they have legal issues, they go to jail, what if we're helping collect bail? All of these things are important. How do I help? How do I help? So I hate this, but in clinical work, we are often expected to do an assessment. The most basic assessment, this is taught in crisis intervention technique training, is plans, means, time frame, intent. So you want to ask someone if they have a plan. You want to ask someone if they know how they're going to do it and if they have the means. You want to ask if they know when, and you want to ask if do they mean to die, or are they trying to get rid of pain? What is it? Um, if the answer is yes to all of these, then risk is high, and you have to decide what it is you're going to do to help them. Um, there are other clinical assessments like the Columbia or the Beck scales, but they're honestly not great at predicting suicide. And I think assessments usually get in the way of building rapport and trust. You can find out this information by having a conversation, and building that rapport and trust is key to diffusing a suicidal crisis. When you're walking a client through an intake and you're discussing informed consent, HIPAA, personal health information, confidentiality, and when it can be broken, there are some things you need to differentiate between. You've really got to look at your paperwork and any agency policies you might be beholden to. One of the biggest fears clinicians have around working with suicidal clients is liability. That comes from a lack of training. It results in clinicians firing people from therapy or hospitalizing them when what they really need is a better understanding of concepts and policies, more exposure to the suicidal people, and better communication skills. I consulted with a mental health not therapist. I do that every 2 weeks though. I consulted with a mental health attorney, and I said, what is with this liability issue? It's my understanding that clinicians are not often sued after a client dies by suicide. And she said, you're right. Prescribers can be sued, hospitals can be sued. And usually it's a kind of a gross negligence. So it's just not likely that this will come up as a practicing clinician. In your informed consent templates, you'll see a lot of things that say a clinician can break confidentiality for a handful of reasons. If a person becomes suicidal, if they're psychotic, which is a whole different issue that I'm not going to go into right now, but it is problematic. If they threaten harm to another, if they're subpoenaed. I've noticed that clinicians will often state that this is because they're mandatory reporters, that they have to break confidentiality, and that's not true. So I want to clarify. Number one, Pennsylvania, if clinicians are subpoenaed, I believe they don't have to break confidentiality, but that's a state law. And especially if there are drugs or alcohol involved, the laws are especially strict. I don't have details. I know I looked that up at some point. But mandatory reporting. We are mandatory reporters, but that is not relevant to suicide. Mandatory reporting is for people who can't actually solve the problem at hand. So elder abuse, child abuse. We're not the people to take care of that. Mandatory reporters report the problem to the agency that can handle the issue. There's also a duty to warn or Tarasoff reporting, which comes from a case where a man said he wanted to kill this woman to his therapist, and the therapist didn't take it seriously, didn't say anything, and the man ended up killing her. So this is about alerting someone that a person has threatened violence against them, and that you have a good reason to worry. And there might be organizational policies in place, and there are ethical questions involved here, but there is no law in place in Pennsylvania regarding mandated reporting or hospitalization, involuntary hospitalization of suicidal folks. The intake session is a perfect time to talk to your clients about where you stand regarding treating suicidal people. Have you done it before? What's your experience? Where are your boundaries when it comes to suicide and when you think someone should be hospitalized? That's subjective. These are different boundaries among different clinicians. This is a chance to communicate and begin to discuss what a safety plan might look like for your clients who have had suicidal thoughts, or even the ones that haven't. It's always good to have a safety plan, to have a sense of how people cope, who their emergency contacts are, who they feel comfortable with you contacting if necessary, blah, blah, blah. You can If you're interested, look into the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. There are some templates, and that's kind of a good exercise to do for yourself and see how it feels. And maybe you can use kind of a modified version with clients. So speaking of laws, the Mental Health Procedures Act is our law in Pennsylvania. It was written in 1976, so it probably needs a little updating. I've read it. It needs updating. The language is horrific. This is the statute on voluntary and involuntary mental health treatment. So a section 201 or 201, we usually just refer to them as the numbers. That is voluntary psychiatric examination and treatment. Anyone 14 or older can consent to inpatient treatment, and admission is based on the psychiatrist's exam. A 302 is your involuntary hospitalization. I have lots of problems with this policy. In order to be 302'd, you have to be deemed severely mentally disabled. You have to be a clear and present danger to yourself or someone else. And there has to be evidence that the danger is going to persist without that intervention. So this is a suicide attempt or some danger and harm to yourself. It's suicide risk. It's attempted or inflicted harm on another person. Whatever behavior a person is exhibiting that makes them a clear and present danger to themselves or others cannot be the result of alcohol or drug use, dementia, or anything that is not mental health related. This has to be mental health related. A 302 petition, so this is the beginning of the 302 process. It's a request for emergency and involuntary examination and treatment. Two groups of people can make that request, or they call it a petition, for treatment for someone they think is a clear and present danger. So a 302A is, a responsible person. So that's a family, friend, other onlooker. 302B is cops or doctors. In a 302A, the petitioner has to present the facts of the case to the county mental health delegate, and they have to fill out some paperwork and say, here's why I think this person needs to be hospitalized. And again, it has to fit those three things that I mentioned before. It can't just be, oh, they're upsetting me, or I don't know, whatever. The mental health delegate will then say, no, I'm not granting a warrant. But if all three of those bullet points are covered, they will they'll issue a warrant, and that allows the police usually to take someone to a hospital. Police being involved in this process is humiliating, degrading. I know from personal experience, sometimes people who are suicidal are handcuffed and treated like criminals. Why? So 302B, cops and doctors, if they are personally observing this dangerous behavior, they can begin the 302 process without a warrant. They don't need to call the mental health delegate. It's nice if they do, they should, but they don't have to. And an approved petition, so the mental health delegate says yes, gives the warrant, that does not mean a person will be committed. It means they will be evaluated. Only a doctor can make the final decision on hospitalization. So if a person is admitted, they can be held up to 120 hours or 5 days, but they can be released at any time if the treatment team feels they no longer meet clinical or legal justification. And when the clock starts on that 120 hours is different based on the county. I know in Montgomery County, there's also a rule that they have to be examined within 2 hours of their arrival at the hospital. If there are other things going on, like they need medical care, Montgomery County will say they have to be medically cleared before that 2-hour clock starts. So they have to be there specifically for that mental health issue, and that's when the 2-hour clock starts. And they have to be examined within a 2-hour period. Then if the doctor says, yes, this person needs to be held, 5 days or less. If after the 120 hours, the treatment team thinks a person needs more care, there are other longer-term involuntary commitment options that can be considered, 303, 304, 305. 303, I think, goes up to 20 days and requires a hearing with someone at the Court of Common Pleas. And the person who wrote the petition has to show up, and the petition will be the judge will go through the petition and make sure that everything is legal before they approve a 303. A 302 prioritizes safety over civil liberty and should always be a last resort. You want to do the least amount of harm possible, the least restrictive means in order to get someone out of a crisis. Other options can be explored, like the 201, the voluntary crisis residential treatment. Beyond being taken in against a person's will, things we should know about a 302 is that a person who's 302 loses their Second Amendment rights for life. I don't like guns. I don't want one in my house, but I will fight for my Second Amendment right. It's my right as an American citizen. And until it's taken away from everyone, I get to have it. Especially because people who are doing violence with guns typically don't have mental health diagnoses. It's usually white men with a history of domestic violence, interpersonal violence. So I will fight for that. There are also risks to this. Involuntary treatment can be traumatic. I cannot tell you the number of stories, horrible stories that I have heard from people who were taken to hospitals against their will. That includes chemical restraints, so being drugged to sedate, physical restraints, so 5-point restraints, catheterized against your will. Lots of stories. I've heard lots of stories, and I could talk about that for a long time. That can be very traumatic. Sometimes it's not. I've also heard good stories about it, but it really depends on the staff where you are, how much experience, how much training they have. And again, a lot of people don't have it. And a lot of people have personal beliefs about suicide that are not particularly empathetic, which, goes against the code of ethics for medical care, but whatever. So after being hospitalized, a person is automatically at higher risk for suicide. An involuntary hospitalization, I believe the higher risk is in the week after. But honestly, the risk for suicide among anyone who has been hospitalized for any reason, not even necessarily mental health related, the risk goes up for the year after the hospitalization. So what I'm saying here is that the benefits of involuntarily hospitalizing someone have to outweigh the risks. Keeping someone alive, prolonging their life, if that's all you're doing it for, I don't think that's a good reason. You can find other ways to support them and prolong their life without traumatizing them. And if it's possible, you should be doing that. So back to some basics. Suicidal people are people. And clinicians are people. Even in our clinical roles, we have to remember that. And we have to do what we can to minimize the power differential between clinician and client, balance the playing field. You can do an assessment, or you can have a conversation, whatever you decide to do. I think you're going to get more information if you're just talking to someone. If you're worried someone's suicidal, be willing to have the conversation. Say the S word. Practice saying suicide. Ask, are you suicidal? Don't ask, are you thinking of hurting yourself? You're not suicidal, are you? And specifically when it comes to the question about hurting oneself, are you asking specifically about self-injury, or are you asking about suicide? It's important to be clear about that, because some people who are suicidal might have that self-injury history. And if you ask that question, they can be like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about hurting myself, but I'm not suicidal. Or, they can kind of work around it. And you want to know the truth in order to be able to support someone the best way you can. Let's see. Know that every suicidal thought isn't a crisis. A lot of people don't know that. Some suicidal thoughts are comforting. Some suicidal thoughts are harm reduction. Sometimes having that one option when a person feels hopeless is the only thing keeping them alive. And I know this sounds counterintuitive or just, completely unrelatable to a lot of people, but that is the experience of a lot of people. So that's worth knowing. Um, Suicidal thoughts occur on a spectrum. Oop, wait, there we go. Suicidal thoughts occur on a spectrum from existential pondering. We have a whole philosophical genre on this stuff, the meaning of life, to actual crisis, which is why it's important to be ready to ask the question, are you suicidal? To listen, to take the time and explore that. Suicidal crises are inconvenient a lot of the time. Sometimes people feel like they don't know how to do it, they're not ready to do it. If you are not in a place, I'm talking as a human, not necessarily a clinician, because then you don't really have a choice. If you're not in a place where you feel like you can handle that emotional, what is my word, burden? I don't like that word, but the weight of that, if if you're struggling yourself or something's going on, don't feel bad that you can't do it, but definitely help the person find someone who can. Be there until you have someone who can help take over. What else? One of the biggest things I've learned from my work with Live Through This is that suicidal thoughts recur for many people, like myself. I've had chronic suicidal thoughts for more than half of my life. Often people just need to talk it through with someone who will listen, who will make them feel safe, and who they feel they can trust. Ask what happened that makes you feel this way. What happened? In social work, we like to say, don't ask what's wrong with you, ask what happened to you. Empathy is huge. You might not be perfect at it. You might feel scared. That's okay. Say, I'm scared and I don't know what to do, but I'm here for you and I want to help you through this. But don't run because you're scared. Ask, how can I help you? Ask, what do you need? Don't say, but you have so much to live for. A suicidal person can't feel that. And even if they know it intellectually, it just might not be connecting. Don't say suicide is selfish. Don't say suicide is weak. If the person has a weapon or other lethal means, and they say that they are suicidal, ask if you can hold the weapon, if they can put it away, or if you can go into a different room together. Ideally, with something like a gun, you want to get it out of the house. That's it. If you can, at the very least, get them out of the room, take bullets out, lock it away. With methods like firearms, most people act within 5 to 10 minutes of making the decision to end their life, and firearms are over 80% effective. So you definitely want to remove that if possible. The very best that you can do is listen, validate, work with your skills and your knowledge, your human intuition, your heart, your ethics, and always remember that the person you're supporting is your priority, not your liability. If they're in crisis, how do you help them through that crisis while allowing them to stay in control? I said this earlier. How do you help them through a crisis while maintaining their definition of safety, not necessarily yours? Traumatized people, people with PTSD or CPTSD, they have boundaries around safety that a lot of us don't understand. Think of it like that. Again, a person's ability to retain their agency, their self-determination should be your primary focus. Do they need to go to the hospital? Who says so? Is it them? That's worth asking. Or do they just need someone to stay with them? If their suicidal thoughts are mental health related, can you reach out to their therapist for them if they have one? Can you help them find one if they want one? Are they having a response to a new medication? There's a diagnosis called akathisia, where medications make people suicidal, and that's really scary. Can you help work things out with those meds? Are they facing houselessness? Can you lend them some money? Can you help them fundraise? What can you do to support them in the way they need to be supported? Call 911 only as a last resort. Many law enforcement officers are not trained in handling suicidal people, and empathizing and working with us. People in crisis and people who identify as BIPOC, queer, trans, Black, brown, indigenous, people of color, are at higher risk for being harmed or killed if cops are involved in their crises. That is just true. That has nothing to do with my feelings about law enforcement. Walter Wallace Jr. Was a Black man who was having a mental health crisis, and that was recent in West Philadelphia. That's one of those stories. There was a man in Florida whose girlfriend called the suicide prevention lifeline for him, to get him help, and the cops showed up. He had a knife, but he was in bed. He never got out of his bed. He didn't make it out of his bed, and he's dead now, and he didn't take his own life. So these are things that we really need to consider. We need to consider a person's context. You should read this thread on Twitter. It is incredible. It's not too long. The URL is right there. Please go read that thread. Before you call the cops, check to see if you have a local mobile crisis team. In Philly, we do. There will be cases where a suicidal person is unkind, where they're violent, where they're maybe experiencing a different reality from yours that makes it impossible for you to diffuse the situation. It's always hard. It's never perfect. You've got to do the best that you can. Again, we're all people, we're all flawed. Resources. So on the left is the resource text that I use in all of my work. If you email me, you'll probably see it. It's on my websites. It just kind of goes through the national resources. So that's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That's Trans Lifeline, which is run by and for trans people. They have a line in Spanish now, I believe, and they also have a friends and family line. The Trevor Project is for queer people, I believe under 25, but I'm not positive. And if you don't want to talk on the phone, you can text crisis text line at 741-741. Warmline.org is also has links to warm lines in the United States. So a warm line is not crisis, but maybe you need someone to talk to and you want to talk to someone who gets it. You want to talk to a peer. So warm lines are always run by peers. It is important to know which of these resources will utilize restrictive interventions. So that's active rescues, it's calling the cops to check on you. Our emergency services. A warm line is least likely to do this. Trans Lifeline will not do it. They will not do it unless you ask for it. So if this is a concern of yours, ask at the beginning of a conversation when you call. What if I say something like, when will you make the move to call the cops? And that allows you to draw your boundaries. Philadelphia specific resources, the mental health delegate hotline. So this is the person who is going to dispatch mobile crisis. They're going to do the involuntary commitment paperwork. They can advise you on other things too. So that's the number there, the Suicide Crisis and Intervention Hotline. This is just the local number to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So the national number is 800-273-8255. This is the local number. If you call the national number, it'll just kind of route you to the people at the local number. There's a community behavioral health warm line, and there's a NAMI warm line. So we've got two warm lines. What else? So I kept this talk pretty clinical, but you should know by now that suicide prevention moves far beyond clinical work. Suicide prevention is having food, housing, a living wage, healthcare. It's supporting people who need help with things like sliding scale therapy fees, legal fees, bail. It's acknowledging structural oppression and white supremacy, and it's doing something about changing that. Again, all of this is in our code of ethics as social workers. Suicide prevention is fighting for disability rights, for civil rights, for reproductive rights, for voting rights. It is valuing lived experience of suicidality rather than judging it. It's letting lived experience inform how we treat suicidal people. It's legitimizing support as peer support specifically as valid and valuable. It's legitimizing being a clinician or an academic with lived experience. Legitimizing being open about that lived experience, rejecting all the gross, harmful prejudice in the mental health and suicidology fields because it is hurting us all. and that trickles down. Suicide prevention is constantly learning and staying up to date on this topic. It's knowing about mental health and involuntary commitment laws in your state, like I just went through, how they affect civil liberties. It's knowing local and national resources, saving them in your phone, knowing which are the best choices for specific people, learning how you can advocate for someone who has been involuntarily committed and who has few supports. I've had people call me from the hospital and they had their hearings and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help. And that is such a terrible feeling for me, but even worse for the person who is in that position. It is understanding that all of this affects Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, and queer folks differently than it would a person who presents as straight and white. That's just the truth. Suicide prevention is thinking critically about the messaging you hear from the suicide prevention field, suicidology, and mental health fields. It's demanding better, and it's fighting for better funding and policy change, demanding better research. It is validating, accepting, appreciating, and celebrating the Black, Brown, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color in your life. It's validating, accepting, appreciating, and celebrating the fat and disabled people in your life. It's validating, accepting, appreciating, and celebrating the trans people in your life. It's donating to their name change or gender marker change funds. It is donating to surgery funds. It's throwing them parties for these big life events. It is loving them. It's believing victims. It's taking care of your friends and family when they need your support, being a safe adult for our kids. I had so few safe adults in my life when I was a teenager, and kids deserve our love and care and guidance, even if they're not our own kids. It is using your skills and your resources to make someone's life better. Can you build a website for them if they need it? Can you navigate opaque systems like the ones attached to social services that are made that way for a reason? Are you a good listener? Can you make people laugh? Can you make them feel safe? Can you take care of kids or do someone's dishes? Can you give someone a ride to an appointment or donate money for their Lyft or donate money for their dinner or donate money for their abortion or other medical care? Can you sit in silence and just support them while they cry? Screaming babies. Suicide prevention is all of these things. It is both subtle and it's explicit. It's literally taking care of one another. It is moving away from this American individualism and back to a collective community, collective care, mutual support. Oh my God. When you're improving a person's quality of life, you are practicing suicide prevention. Oh, that was supposed to be there a while ago. Those were all my big ideas. Oh, wow, that's good. Calojero's Guide to Preventing Suicide is a one-pager back and front that I made that kind of talks through a lot of these things. You can download it on the resources and citations page that I made for this presentation. It is there. There are some other things there too. And yeah, go there. And then if you want to email me or follow me on social media, I am hard to find. I meant to take that donate link out of there because I'm not trying to get y'all to donate to my work right now. But yeah, email me, talk to me. It might take me a while to get back to you, but I always will. Thank you for listening.